Okay, so here we are at the entrance to the studio. And so come on into my studio. So one of the things you'll notice is that I have a fabulous view out one side. Well, of course, there's a lot of reflection today. Out one side, you see that we have the forest and my fabric and my work wall and my ironing table. And out the other side of the studio, we have a beautiful view out over the water of the Puget Sound with our bird feeders in the foreground. And on a clear day, you can see Mount Baker straight out the window. So I get a lot of inspiration just being at home, looking out the window. So this is basically my workspace. It's about half the size of the workspace that I had when I lived in Paducah and had my big 8,000 square foot studio with a classroom and everything. But I'm finding, well, first of all, I don't have to store everything in my studio. We have a wonderful dry basement, and a lot of my stash and my hand-dyed fabrics and archives and extra sewing machines are stored there. And then also I'm finding that having my tables and equipment stored very close, well, not stored, but located very close to each other is sometimes very convenient because I can use two work surfaces at the same time. So basically this is my desk with my computer. And one of the things I've gotten very interested in lately is making digital fabric. So the computer is always kind of very much part of my creative process. Well, let me kind of back up and talk a little bit about my fabric first. All the fabric that I use in my quilts is my own fabric. Either I've hand dyed it or designed it. And so this would be fabric that is dyed in gradations. This is fabric that is hand painted. And so this would be like a typical hand painted fabric. Oh, well, this might be a little better than a typical one, but this would be a hand painted fabric. It would be something that has a little more visual texture, more like a print fabric, and multi-colors within a single fabric, another hand painted fabric. And this is some of my collections of fabric that I've designed for Benartex. It looks just like my hand painted because it is based on that, but it's printed commercially, so you can get more if you run out. And lately I've started doing digital fabric. So this is digital fabric that I've designed on my computer and sent to a company called Spoonflower and had it printed commercially, professionally. So for years I've been printing fabric on my home computer, but then you're limited to the width of your printer, and you have to soak fabric, and it's all a very complicated process. It's much easier to just design it and send it off and have it delivered later to your studio, all printed for you. So that's my fabric. So this is where I'm now designing fabric, and I'm really buzzed about that. And I'm going to have Ron, my wonderful spouse, come and hold this while I show you a little bit about what I've been doing lately. I was asked about a year ago to make a quilt about the women's suffrage movement. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And so I agreed to do this quilt. And I started looking online at suffrage information, and I came up with this photo. I think I even have a better, let's see. This is, Okay, this is the photo I found. And it looked like a lot of ladies at a quilt guild meeting holding up a quilt. And so design-wise, I decided that I would sort of do those ladies holding up a quilt. So I just kind of plugged in a quilt. And then I thought, well, I had a quote by Susan B. Anthony. And then I thought, well, what if I put pictures of women who have done significant first things in the 100 years since women got the right to vote. And I started plugging in people in this sort of generic traditional quilt. And then I thought, well, how about if I just design a hexagonal quilt? Duh. Grandmother's flower garden, how appropriate. And I sort of narrowed it down to these 3 women. And let me see. I have to get the right picture up here. Here we go. So I started making paintings. So on this particular computer, I'm actually able, and you can see that this is an old photograph that doesn't have a lot of detail. It gets pretty pixelated when you get close up. And there's close up. So that's what I was working with. But I can make drawings right on the computer. So here is this sketch of this woman, and I have this lovely little stylus here, and I can actually pick up any color over here and make it lighter or darker, and then actually draw right on the computer screen. Well, my little stylus is failing me here for some reason, but you can see that I can draw on the computer screen, and I can pick another color and draw over that. And then I can kind of blend those colors together. So, I mean, this is basically painting and drawing right on the computer screen. Part of some of the ways that I'm able to create my own fabric. So, you probably have some questions about that.
Well, first of all, I'm curious about what computer program are you painting in?
Well, from the day I got my first computer, I've used Corel Draw, which is a competitive product to Adobe Illustrator and Adobe Photoshop. So I'm using Corel Draw and Corel Photo Paint. They do the same thing. They're just competitive products.
And when you're making, well, I'm curious actually, what comes after this? What comes after you've done this? And it's an amazing transition or evolution from the photograph, just in terms of the expression in her face and how real she seems now.
Right. Well, you make any old black and white photograph color, it looks a little more realistic. And you know, hopefully I got enough expression that somebody who knew her might be able to recognize her. Yeah. But the point was to illustrate the women who were working really hard to make this happen. And when we go in the other room and look at the actual quilt, I'll talk more about that.
Okay,
but,
great.
Let me show you another example of a digital quilt that I made recently. That was actually kind of a collaboration between Ron and myself. And this one is called Watch Number 1.
That's amazing.
Is the light bad there? Let's go back here where the light is better.
Yeah, that's good.
So my father was a watchmaker, and I inherited his watchmaker's cabinet with all of the watch parts in it. And there were a whole bunch of partial watch movements. And I started looking at them as just abstract designs. And we started by scanning them with a digital microscope and then photographing them with macro lenses. And then Ron figured out that he could take about 10 pictures at different focal lengths and put them together in a photo stacking function of some sort. He's the one who knows about all this photo stuff, and get everything in focus. And so I didn't do the whole picture. I just picked a part of the picture that was an interesting geometric pattern and had that printed on fabric, and then quilted the heck out of it. And so this is what you might call a collaboration between the two of us.
Wow. Can I ask, so do you have, for your quilting, do you have a long arm or a mid arm? What machine?
Well, let me show you what I use for quilting. And just follow me.
Okay.
So this is a machine that I got in 1999. It used to be a Bernina industrial factory machine.
Oh,
and
wow.
it was souped up by a guy in Utah who made about 2 of these a year in his garage and isn't doing it anymore. But in the meantime, a lot of the commercial sewing machine companies, including Bernina, have come out with versions of sit down. So I have a sewing machine with a long arm. I think the modern way of referring to these is a stationary head or a movable head. I don't use a movable head machine. I use a stationary sit-down machine with a long arm. I have 21 inches under the head. And so I'm basically moving the quilt under the needle as I'm quilting, and so doing mostly free motion, but this machine also, I can put feed dogs into this machine and do regular sewing on it, but I have 2 Berninas, one of which is pushed down under the table at the moment, and the other one is set up. So I do all my piecing on a regular domestic Bernina. And I do most of my quilting on this legacy machine, the industrial machine, because I have all this extra scooching room. So this is actually another digital quilt. We went to Antelope Canyon in September, which is one of the places I wanted to go to since the very first time I saw a picture of it. And this is a photograph on the wall over here that I took in Antelope Canyon. And I actually did a digital painting of this photograph and had it printed on fabric, and now I'm doing a lot of very heavy quilting on it. And once I get it on fabric, I'm just treating it as an abstract design. I'm not necessarily trying to make it look exactly like the photograph. I'm just having fun with thread.
Well, that looks amazing.
So I have a quilt on the wall here. Also, this is, I said I kind of got a burst of creativity, so I've made quite a few quilts in the last couple of months. The quilt that's on the wall here is called Splash, and this is kind of another collaborative quilt. About half of the fabric in this comes from a photograph that we took, or Ron took, when we were up at the north end of Vancouver Island this summer, photographing wildlife. And this is a Pacific white-sided dolphin. And about half of this is my Benartex fabric, and it is done with applique. And half of it is a very manipulated version of a photograph blown up and printed on fabric.
It's beautiful.
So kind of a combination of the two. So let me show you a couple other things about the studio. I'm just going to walk around with the iPad here.
Okay.
And I don't need to be in this picture. This is my ironing table. I just had a Parsons table built the exact size of a hollow core door and covered a hollow core door with really nice ironing board fabric. And it's exactly, it was a custom table, so it's exactly the height I need to work at. And then I have all these drawer stacks, which I've had just for years, that I have all of my equipment stored in and labeled. so that I actually know what's in the drawers because they
Yeah.
all look exactly alike.
Hey, Carol.
Yes.
So I'm noticing that your studio is super neat. Do you keep it at this level of neatness all the time, or do you clean up for us?
When I'm in the middle of piecing a quilt, there is just fabric stacked everywhere. And no, it's not this neat all of the time. But I do like to work in a neat environment. So usually before I start quilting, I kind of clean things up so I'm not looking at all the clutter.
Right.
I push all my sewing tables together. This is my other Bernina sewing machine down here on the bottom. This is one of those horn tables that you can just push the machine and it pops up or pops down. When I'm quilting, I like to keep the whole surface pretty flat so that I can move everything freely. And when I'm piecing, I have both of the Berninas up so I can have two different kinds of thread in the machine and just go back and forth from one machine to the other. So, and right behind the quilting machine, I have all my thread.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to hand this back to Ron so I can show you the thread.
Good.
So I have all of my thread chromatically arranged. This shouldn't surprise you by now. You know I'm into gradations, right? I have all my thread in these drawers that are right here behind my machine. And I have a backless stool instead of a chair so that I can just swirl around.
Nice.
And get my thread out of the drawers when I'm changing thread colors. And right now I'm working on this quilt with all of the rusty reds, and so the colors that I'm using all the time, I just have sitting out on my little table here.
And what is your favorite brand of thread, if you care to say?
Oh gosh, well, I bought all of this discontinued machine embroidery thread about 20 years ago, and it's basically a lifetime supply. But if I'm buying new thread, I usually buy Superior, and I like the 40 weight threads a lot. Although I did endorse one of the lines of thread that they did a few years ago that's a 30 weight, which is even heavier. So if you really want it to show up, that's what I use if I need a heavier thread, but most of my threads are 40 weight.
Okay.
So, okay, what else is interesting in the studio? Here's my overhead projector. This is a little fold-up model that I can just stand up and project my images on the wall when I'm ready to blow them up from page size to full size. I already showed you the transparency that I use, and well, we all grew up with these in school. Yeah. It's probably hard to find them anymore.
Yes, that took me back to 6th grade very quickly.
So this is the light table that I use when I'm piecing things together to line everything up. And I just got a new one at Houston that I don't have set up here yet. That's even bigger and brighter. So that's where I put my fabric when I'm piecing things together.
Neat.
So one of the things that you'll notice as we go through the house is that I have a lot of my quilts hanging. And I also have a collection of quilts by other people. So let me just show a couple quilts here. This is a quilt. These are people, a lot of people from my group in Chicago when I still lived in Chicago. This is a quilt by Frida Anderson, one by Sharon Malik, one by Melody Johnson. And a lot of these people have become very well known, but I knew them before they were so famous that I couldn't afford to buy their work. So I was very lucky to buy work from a lot of famous people early on when all of us were nobodies. So unless you have any other questions about the working studio, I'd love to take you into our gallery.
Oh, let's go to the gallery. That sounds wonderful.
Okay. So quilts hanging everywhere.
Wow.
This is the entry to our home, and we have quilts on several levels here.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing.
We like to be colorful.
That comes as no surprise.
So,
Now, did
I'm sorry, this house had a formal living and dining room, which we do use occasionally, but rarely. Like most people these days, we live very casually. And so we turned the formal living area into a gallery. So welcome to my gallery. So once or twice a year, we do an open house. And at that point, we cover all the doors and windows with quilts and hang quilts over the coat closets and everywhere else. But right now we have a few extra quilts hanging in our dining room. But the living room walls are always covered with quilts. As these quilts go out to various exhibitions, I'm bringing more quilts into the space. So, and I'll be very happy to talk about any of these quilts that you would like to ask questions about.
Well, first of all, I think I see the quilt you were talking about in the other room.
Yes.
Which is amazing. So if you want to talk about that. And then I see some other very famous quilts that we can talk about.
So this is First Ladies. And so you'll recognize these from the photograph I showed you earlier. These are three of the ladies who were holding up the banner. The picture was actually taken in 1920, 2 weeks before the last state necessary to make suffrage into law ratified the amendment. And so these ladies are in Washington, D.C., and they're waiting to go to the Republican National Convention in Chicago. And they're holding up this banner, and they're all officers in the National Women's Party. And so rather than having a banner, I decided to make a quilt within a quilt. And so I designed a quilt of all hexagons, and I designed every single fabric in the little hexagons. And then I started putting faces of women who have been important in the 100 years since suffrage was ratified. So I put 20 women in and called Ron, and he came in, and the first thing he said was, well, what about Madeleine Albright? And I said, well, because she wasn't the first female presidential cabinet member, Frances Perkins was back in the 30s. But I did start thinking about some of the choices I had made, and I did some more research online, and I started discovering all of these women who in the last 100 years have done really important things that were first for their gender or ethnicity or religion or whatever, or have really moved forward human rights in general. And so some of my original 20 got downloaded to just names, but I decided that I would put all the names on, and I ended up with 165 names of women who did important things first. And so all of the names are written within the hexagons.
Oh, neat.
And these are the 20 that I decided were the most important, or at least they, I wanted at least 2 representatives from each decade. So some decades had more important ones than others. Anyway,
oh,
so
that's really
you
neat.
see the names. Well, then I thought, well, you know, people who are just looking at this in a quilt show are never going to know what all these names are. And so maybe I should put a key on the back, but then nobody at a quilt show is ever going to see the back. So I made a quilt within a quilt, and the key is underneath. And so if you see a name on the front of the quilt and you're not sure what this person did, you can go to the key and find them listed in alphabetical order according to their first names. And you can see why it was important for them to be on the quilt. And then I have a little sign that says, "Lived here." So when this travels to the quilt museums all over the country in 2020 to 2022, it will travel with a little container of gloves. So that this will be the only thing in the museum you're allowed to touch, because I do want people to lift this and see the names underneath.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that. And I love everything about that quilt. The colors are so beautiful. I love the background behind the women with the Capitol building, but also whatever the purplish haze or coloration to the side of that. It's just gorgeous.
Yeah, well, that's another fabric that I designed. I wanted it to be sort of rainbow colored.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want it to just be a photograph of the Capitol building. So I won't explain the whole thing. It's a long story how I created that image. But when you're at a distance, you can clearly see the Capitol building. When you're about 2 feet away, you stop being able to focus on the Capitol building. You know, kind of like those old sort of op art things that we used to buy in the 70s.
Well, Caryl, show us. I know it's an impossible question to say, oh, what is your favorite? But what is a quilt in your personal gallery that has a great deal of personal significance to you? Or a quilt you just feel a lot of affection for?
I suppose the one called "On the Wings of the Dream" would be the most personal, because it's really kind of a portrait of me. As I mentioned before, my first husband died, and so a year after he died, I was in my new studio. Everything in my life was new. I had left my home and my friends in Chicago. I had moved to Paducah. I had new friends. I had a new home. My husband was gone. Everything was new. And so this quilt, my whole life I had wanted to dance, and I thought dancing would feel like flying. And flying for me has always been a metaphor of the ultimate feeling of freedom. And all of a sudden I have everything in my life is new, and I have a chance to regret the past or move on and go joyfully into a new chapter in my life. And so that's really what this is about. So for me, sort of one of my personal totems of changes in my life has always been the white bird. And so the dancer is merged with the white bird, and that's moving forward into the new chapter in my life. And then the eagle represents my old life and my first husband, who are still very much part of my life, in my heart and in my head, but I'm moving on because they're no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
So
It's such a beautiful quilt.
thank you. And the one just to the left of it is one that I did for the dawning of the new millennium. It's called New Dawn, and it's full of sort of archetypal images that are symbols of new beginnings. I sort of have a new beginning theme going on in my living room here. So this quilt has the phoenix, of course, rising from the flame. That's a new beginning. And it has the rainbow colors, which is a symbol of new beginnings, and the spiral, which is a symbol of new life emerging, and the sun and the portal. And so it's a little more formal arrangement than a lot of my really abstract quilts. But it was made specifically for an exhibit of quilts celebrating the new millennium. It was made in 2000. So the one just to the left of that is a fairly recent quilt. It's about 3 or 4 years old, that has just been on the show circuit. And this would be sort of a very typical Caryl Bryer Fallert quilt, I suppose. I think anybody who knew my work at all would see this and think, oh, I bet that quilt was made by Caryl Bryer Fallert. It has the rainbow colors and the intersecting color and value gradations and the spirals. Well, what can I say? That's just my aesthetic.
Your signature is there. Your signatures are there for sure.
So come on into the dining room and I'll show you a few more quilts. If we have a formal dinner in the dining room, we do actually take the quilts down. But since we have a lovely breakfast nook, we don't use the dining room very often. And I discovered that I can hang quilts from the soffit without moving any of the furniture.
Oh, that's neat.
So, well, this is another quilt that is all about intersecting color and value gradations. It's all made from the fabric that I designed for Benartex. This is made from some hand-dyed fabric, some Benartex fabric, and another photograph that was taken by Ron of one of our Port Townsend neighbors who plays the bandoneon, which is the national instrument of Argentina. He actually sold his medical practice and moved to Argentina to learn how to play this instrument. And Ron captured him in a moment when he was just exuding joy. So I loved that picture. So I kind of created my own background and the shadow of the tango dancers, implying that dancing is going on in the room, but not where you can actually see it.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful.
So, and come on through. And this is a quilt I told you about earlier that I designed entirely on the computer and actually scanned the fabrics and plugged them into the quilt design. This is made from 4 fabrics. The entire quilt is made from 4 fabrics in my gradations collection. And it's called Checks and Balances. So at the time I made this quilt, I was doing Pilates and yoga 3 times a week, and I can do at least 3 of these poses.
Would you do one now, or is that asking too much?
Well,
no.
maybe afterward.
Okay.
Maybe this one. So the one over here, another spiral piece that is all about intersecting color and value gradations. You can see that I have every color of the rainbow juxtaposed against its complement on the color wheel, which again makes the eye vibrate, and then the big spiral. It's I call this it's just a big piece of eye candy. It doesn't have any deep philosophical concepts.
It's just so amazing how it looks lit from outside the quilt, but it's not. It's just those colors at work.
And then the one next to that is completely different. This is another digital quilt, and this is earlier before Spoonflower. This is one that I made actually many years ago. And this is my father's watch cabinet that I inherited. And these are the drawers, pictures of the drawers and all the stuff that was in them. And each one is like a little individual composition. And then I took a lot of the watch parts and glued them onto the quilt. And so the quilt is called Watch Master. And believe it or not, there are still a lot of watch parts in those drawers, even after gluing all of these onto the quilts.
Oh, wow. It's so interesting.
So this is where I live and what you might see if you came to one of my open houses or came to visit me in Port Townsend, Washington.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your space with us. It's just amazing that you walk inside and this is what greets you. It's beautiful.
Yes, well, it's been my pleasure, and you can go on my website on my news page if I have an open house and I'm inviting everybody in. I will put it on my news page or on my newsletter. If you sign up for my newsletter, I promise I will not spam you or sell my list to anybody else.
Well, that is good to know. I'm sure you will get a lot of new signups. And this has just been Just wonderful. I want to thank you for your time and for your generous sharing of your stories and your quilts.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Caryl.
Thank you.